Hi, I'm Certified Personal Property Appraiser Dave Maloney, author of Appraising Personal Property, Principles and Methodology. This video is another in a series of hot tips for the personal property appraiser. To see all my videos, visit my YouTube channel at youtube.com/asktheappraiser. Note that throughout these tips I make reference to USPAP. USPAP is an acronym for the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, which are promulgated by the Appraisal Foundation of Washington, D.C. The goal of USPAP, which is updated biennially, is to maintain public trust in the appraisal profession. For more information about USPAP, visit appraisalfoundation.org. In this video, I will explain your USPAP obligations. Those parts of USPAP to which you must comply will vary depending on whether or not the public expects that you will perform as an appraiser, on whether or not you are performing in the role of an appraiser or in some non-appraiser role, such as an estate liquidator or downsizing specialist, and lastly, on the type of valuation service being provided. Do you need to comply with USPAP in the first place? Whether or not you need to comply with USPAP depends largely on what the expectations are of the public, which includes your client and other intended users of the report. Perhaps it's because of your own self-promotion as one who offers appraisal services that the public is led to expect that you will provide valuation services that are competent, ethical, and without bias. Having an appraiser's website, pressing out brochures and business cards advertising your appraisal services, being a member of an appraisal society, participating in local appraisal days, etc. These are all reasons for the public to have every right to expect that you will perform as a professional appraiser. That being the case, for all intents and purposes, you are considered an appraiser and you should comply with USPAP in order to maintain the public's trust in our profession. Note that I said should comply, but there are also times when you must comply. If you are required by law or regulation, such as our real property appraisers, or by agreement with the client to perform in accordance with USPAP, or if you state in the assignment report that you do comply to USPAP, or if you are compelled to comply by your parent appraisal society, then you must comply with USPAP. For those who are members of such a society, not complying with USPAP would be a violation of your society's code of ethics. What is more, failure to comply with USPAP, which after all is the generally accepted standard for appraisers, increases your exposure to charges of malpractice. Note that USPAP does not apply to all those who offer valuation services. It only applies to appraisers like you and me, who are performing in the role of an appraiser, that is, one in whom the client has trust, one who the client is expecting to perform competently, ethically, and without bias. Car dealers will tell you the trade-in value of your car. That's a valuation service, but it's a valuation service being performed by a non-appraiser, so USPAP does not apply to the car dealer or to the valuation service he is providing. A pawn shop owner will tell you how much your ring is worth and how much he is willing to pay to buy it. That too is a valuation service, but again, it's a valuation service that is being provided by a non-appraiser. So USPAP does not apply either to the pawn shop owner or to the valuation service he provided. Car dealers and pawn shop owners offer valuation services that are self-serving and with bias, and chances are they have no training as appraisers. One would hardly expect the public to consider them to be performing as appraisers, and indeed they are not. USPAP only applies to recognized appraisers and not to non-appraisers. Let's now assume that you are a recognized appraiser within your community and that you are required by societal mandate to comply with USPAP. Must all the valuation services you provide comply with USPAP? The answer is no, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But first, this question brings up an important issue. A moment ago, I stated that USPAP only applies to recognized appraisers. I will now qualify that statement. USPAP only applies to recognized appraisers, but only when they are performing in the role of an appraiser when providing valuation services. Most individuals who are recognized in the community as being appraisers also have other lines of work other than appraising. We are also antiques dealers, auctioneers, estate liquidators, repair and restoration specialists, jewelry store owners, downsizing specialists, brokers, damage and claims adjusters, etc. In other words, we also perform at times as non-appraisers. So are all valuation services that we provide, even those we provide as non-appraisers, subject to the requirements of USPAP? The answer is no. But we who are recognized appraisers need to take special precautions when performing valuation services as a non-appraiser. As recognized appraisers in our community, the public is going to expect that whenever we are called upon to provide a valuation service, that service will be performed competently, ethically, and without bias. Because of this expectation, if we ever provide a valuation service while performing in a role other than as an appraiser, such as while performing as an estate liquidator, we must take extra precaution to ensure that the public is not inadvertently being deceived. For instance, assume that I am a recognized appraiser who also runs a successful estate liquidation business. As an estate liquidator, I will price items advantageously so that they will sell within the 2-day estate sale period. I will promote the sale by revealing the nature and location of the property. I will accept a contingency fee from the client. I will be biased in favor of the client. I will market the items in a favorable light. All these practices, lack of confidentiality, contingency fees, bias in favor of the client, bias in favor of the property, these are commonly accepted for the estate liquidator, but they're prohibited by USPAP when the individual is performing as an appraiser. So, as a recognized appraiser who is performing outside the role of an appraiser, in order to prevent the client from being misled regarding my services as an estate liquidator, I must clearly explain my dual role to the client and ensure that the client is aware that I am not, in this assignment, performing as an appraiser. Since USPAP only applies to appraisers, let's now consider the types of valuation services that are performed by appraisers. USPAP refers to valuation services being performed by an appraiser as appraisal practice. Non-appraisers might offer valuation services, but since they are not appraisers, they cannot perform appraisal practice, so cannot be regulated by USPAP. Only appraisers can perform appraisal practice, and all appraisal practice is governed by USPAP. Appraisal practice includes, but is not limited to, appraisals, appraisal reviews, and appraisal consulting. For these 3 types of appraisal practice, USPAP has standards that apply. There are 10 such standards. For instance, when performing a personal property appraisal, the appraiser must comply with USPAP's standards 7 and 8. Real property appraisals must conform to standards 1 and 2. For these 3 types of appraisal practice, appraisals, appraisal reviews, and appraisal consulting, in addition to the relevant standards, the appraiser must also comply with USPAP's scope of work rule, the record-keeping rule, and the general obligations of USPAP. USPAP's general obligations apply to all forms of appraisal practice, and they include complying with USPAP's definitions, preamble, ethics rule, competency rule, and the jurisdictional exception rule. But appraisal practice also includes other types of valuation services performed by appraisers. Examples of these other services include writing appraisal books, writing or teaching appraisal classes, conducting market data research, providing valuation-related litigation support to an attorney, helping a homeowner price items for an upcoming yard sale, assisting an auction gallery assigning pre-sale auction estimates for an upcoming sale, conducting the subject property inspection in order to identify the property's value-relevant characteristics, etc. There are no USPAP standards that apply when the appraiser performs these other services. And for these other services, neither the scope of work rule nor the record-keeping rule apply. However, when performing these other services, the appraiser is still obligated to comply with the general obligations of USPAP that I mentioned earlier. And finally, what USPAP obligations apply to the individual who is recognized as being an appraiser, but who, for a particular assignment, is wearing a different hat? That is, he is not performing as an appraiser. Instead, he is performing as, say, a dealer or as an estate liquidator. In such a scenario, the individual is not performing as an appraiser, so is not bound by USPAP's general obligations, by any standard, or by the scope of work or record-keeping rules. But since the individual is known as an appraiser, the only USPAP obligation with which the individual must comply is the ethics rules admonition to not misrepresent him or herself as performing as an appraiser when, in fact, that is not the case. Let's summarize this discussion by means of this table, which illustrates the individual's obligations to comply with USPAP when providing various types of valuation services, and while acting both as an appraiser as well as in the role other than as an appraiser. The leftmost column lists the various categories of USPAP obligations. First are the general obligations, which include definitions, preamble, the ethics rule, the competency rule, and the jurisdictional exception rule. The second category of additional obligations includes the applicable performance standards, the scope of work rule, and the record-keeping rule. The third category is simply the ethics rule obligation to not misrepresent oneself as an appraiser when not performing as an appraiser. Across the top row are the types of activities an individual might perform either as an appraiser or as a non-appraiser. The first category includes the three appraisal practice activities of appraisal, appraisal review, and appraisal consulting performed by the individual while acting as an appraiser. The second category includes all appraisal practice activities other than appraisal, appraisal reviews, and appraisal consulting performed by the individual while acting, again, as an appraiser. These are other types of appraisal practice activities. They might include writing appraisal course books, teaching appraisal classes, conducting comparable market data research, etc. The third category of activities includes any valuation service performed by the individual while the individual is not acting in the capacity of an appraiser. This might include acting as a dealer buying goods, as an auctioneer obtaining property for consignment, or as an estate liquidator assisting in the disposition of a client's household goods. It might also include acting as a jewelry store owner who is offering to purchase jewelry or gold from the public. But in all these cases, the individual is not acting as an appraiser and should not give the impression that valuation services are being performed as if he is an appraiser. That is, as if such services are being performed competently and in a manner that is independent, impartial, and objective, because, frankly, they are not. So, what are your USPAP compliance obligations? If performing either appraisals, appraisal reviews, or appraisal consulting, the appraiser must comply with these USPAP general obligations. By the way, these general obligations apply to all appraisal practice and not just to appraisals, appraisal reviews, and appraisal consulting. But in addition to the general obligations, when performing either appraisals, appraisal reviews, or appraisal consulting, the appraiser must also comply with additional obligations. These additional obligations mandate compliance with the requirements of those of the 10 standards that are applicable to the assignment, such as Standards 7 and 8 for the personal property appraiser performing an appraisal, or Standard 3 if performing an appraisal review. The additional obligations also include compliance with the scope of work rule, as well as the record-keeping rule. But what are my obligations when I am, say, writing an appraisal course or helping a client price items for an upcoming yard sale? None of the 10 standards apply to such appraisal practice services. When the appraiser is performing appraisal practice services other than appraisals, appraisal reviews, or appraisal consulting, none of the performance standards 1 through 10 do apply. There is no scope of work to be determined or performed, and there is no record-keeping requirement. Therefore, the only obligations that apply when performing these other types of appraisal practice services are the general obligations of USPAP. Abide by the definitions and preamble, be ethical, be competent, etc. And finally, when performing outside the role of an appraiser altogether, such as when performing as an auctioneer, a dealer, or a state liquidator, neither the general nor those additional obligations of USPAP apply, since the individual is not performing as an appraiser, and the general and additional obligations of USPAP apply only to appraisers performing as appraisers. The only obligation, therefore, with which to comply when performing outside the role of an appraiser is the ethics rules admonition against misrepresentation. For example, do not represent that you are performing as an appraiser when performing as a dealer and making an offer to buy property that someone has brought to your antiques shop to sell. For more information regarding USPAP's compliance requirements, see USPAP's Advisory Opinion number 21. This concludes this hot tip. For several hundred pages crammed with hot tips for the personal property appraiser, get a copy of my book, Appraising Personal Property, Principles and Methodology, at appraisalcourseassociates.com.